My sister-in-law begged me to raise her baby for the family, but the DNA test proved my husband's secret. My sister-in-law Rachel adopted a baby 4 years ago from her best friend who didn't want to raise it, and we all supported her being a single mom by choice until she got MS and asked us to take the child, and I agreed thinking I was helping family. She'd talked about wanting to be a mom for years. When her friend Amber got pregnant and said she couldn't handle a baby, Rachel stepped up immediately. "This is meant to be," she said at the family dinner where she announced the adoption. We all celebrated. My husband Ethan bought a crib for Rachel's apartment. His parents threw a welcome party for the baby. I helped paint the nursery yellow because Rachel didn't want to know the gender until the baby arrived. Everyone was so happy Rachel was finally getting to be the mom she'd always wanted to be. The baby was perfect. Healthy, happy, looked a bit like Rachel actually, which everyone said was destiny. Sometimes adopted babies just match their real parents, my mother-in-law said. Rachel was an amazing mother. Patient, loving, never complained about the sleepless nights or endless diapers. She brought the baby to every family gathering and we all took turns holding them, playing with them, watching them grow. Ethan was a devoted uncle, always offering to babysit, buying too many toys, teaching the kid to throw a ball before they could properly walk. "You're going to be such a good dad someday," Rachel would tell him, and he'd look at me and smile. We'd been trying for a year at that point with no luck. 2.5 years ago, Rachel started dropping things, forgetting words, stumbling on flat ground. The diagnosis came fast and harsh. Multiple sclerosis, aggressive form. The doctor said she had maybe 5 good years if she was lucky. She asked us to take the child that same day. "I can't do this alone anymore," she cried in my kitchen. "And if something happens to me, they need stability. You and Ethan are the only ones I trust." How could we say no? We had the space, the time, the love to give. Still no kids of our own despite the fertility treatments. Taking in Rachel's child felt like the universe giving us a chance to be parents. We moved them in the next week, set up the old guest room as a kid's room, enrolled them in preschool near our house. Rachel visited every day at first, then every few days as she got weaker, then weekly when the wheelchair became permanent, but she never missed a bedtime story over video call. Never forgot to say I love you. The child called her Mama Rachel and us aunt and uncle even though we did all the daily parenting. It worked. We were a strange little family, but we were happy Ethan never acted different around the child. Never seemed guilty or weird or overly attached. He was exactly what you'd expect. A good uncle helping his sick sister and loving his nephew or niece like any family would. I had no reason to suspect anything. None. Last month, Rachel asked me to come over alone. Said she needed to discuss something important about the child's future. I thought maybe she wanted to make the adoption official, transfer legal guardianship. Instead, she was crying before I even sat down. "I have to tell you something," she said. "I've been lying to everyone and I can't die with this secret." "What secret?" "The baby isn't adopted." "Not really. Amber didn't just give me her baby. She gave me Ethan's baby." I laughed. Actually laughed because it was so absurd. That's impossible. Amber and Ethan used to hook up. In college, after college, whenever they were both single. It was their thing. No strings, just sex when they needed it. My stomach turned. That was before me. It was. Except for once. The weekend before your wedding. Your bachelorette party was in Vegas. His bachelor party was supposed to be camping, but they came back early. Amber was in town. They got drunk. It happened. No. 9 months later, she had a baby. Ethan's baby. She didn't want it, didn't want him to know, didn't want to ruin your marriage. So she came to me. Asked if I'd take the baby. Say it was a regular adoption. I'd get the child I wanted. You'd get the marriage you deserved. The baby would have a family. Everyone would win. Everyone would win? I've been raising my husband's affair baby for 2 years. You've been raising my child. That's all anyone needed to know. But it's not your child. It's his. Biology doesn't matter. It does when it's based on betrayal. He cheated on me. Once, one time, right before the wedding when he was scared and drunk and stupid. You knew. This whole time you knew and you let me play house with his secret child. I was protecting you. And now I'm telling you because the truth will come out eventually. The child looks more like Ethan every day. People will start asking questions. Medical history will matter. I wanted you to hear it from me first. I went home and confronted Ethan immediately. He denied everything. Swore Rachel was confused. Maybe the MS was affecting her thinking. Said Amber was just a friend. Nothing more. Nothing ever happened. So I demanded a DNA test. The lab called 3 days later saying the results were ready and I could pick them up anytime during business hours. I drove there during lunch when Ethan was at work because I couldn't stand the thought of him being anywhere near me when I opened that envelope. The parking lot was mostly empty, and I sat in my car with the engine off, holding the sealed manila folder the receptionist had handed me, with a neutral smile like she was giving me routine blood work results instead of proof that would destroy my entire life. My hands shook so badly I almost couldn't tear the seal. The paper inside was covered in numbers and percentages and technical language, but the conclusion was printed in bold at the bottom. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. Ethan was the biological father. Rachel had told me the truth. My husband had cheated on me the weekend before our wedding, and I'd spent 2 years raising his affair baby without knowing it. I sat there staring at those numbers until they blurred, and my chest felt so tight I thought I might pass out. I couldn't go home. Couldn't face our house, our bed, the child's room we'd set up together while I thought I was helping family. I started the car and drove to Sloane's house across town because she was the only person who knew me before Ethan, before this marriage, before I became someone who could be fooled. This completely. Sloane opened her front door and took one look at my face before pulling me inside without asking any questions. I tried to hand her the paper, but I was shaking too hard, and it fell on her entryway floor. She picked it up and read it while I stood there feeling like my legs might give out. Then she wrapped her arms around me, and I finally broke down, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, could barely stand. She held me up and guided me to her couch, and I cried into her shoulder for what felt like hours, making awful choking sounds I'd never made before. When I could finally talk, I explained everything in broken sentences. Rachel's confession, Ethan's denial, the DNA test I'd demanded, the proof I was holding, the 2 years I'd spent loving a child who was biologically my husband's, while everyone around me knew the truth except me. Sloane kept saying she was sorry, kept rubbing my back, kept handing me tissues that I soaked through immediately. She asked if I'd told Ethan yet, and I shook my head because I didn't know how to face him with this, didn't know what to say or do or feel beyond this crushing weight in my chest. Sloane pulled out her phone and called her husband Cole, who worked as a family lawyer downtown. She explained the situation in calm, clinical terms that made it sound less like my life imploding and more like a legal case, which I guess it was now. Cole said he'd come home early, and he showed up 40 minutes later with his briefcase, and this gentle, careful expression that made me want to cry all over again. He sat across from me and asked me to explain the whole situation from the beginning, taking notes on a legal pad while I talked. Then he explained the legal reality in terms I could barely process. The adoption was never finalized. Rachel had temporary custody through some kind of guardianship arrangement that was supposed to become permanent but never did. Probably because she got too sick to handle the paperwork. Ethan was the biological father, which gave him parental rights. Amber had signed away her rights when she gave the baby to Rachel. And me? I had no legal standing at all despite 2 years of being the primary caregiver. If Rachel died without updating her custody arrangements, Ethan would have the strongest legal claim to the child. I could lose everything. Cole said we needed to talk to Rachel immediately about formalizing custody arrangements while she was still legally competent to make decisions. The words felt like they were coming from underwater, and I couldn't quite make sense of them except for one horrible truth. The law saw me as nothing. I had to leave eventually, because the child got out of preschool at 3, and I'd never missed a pickup. Not once in 2 years. That consistency mattered now more than ever, even though everything else was falling apart. I drove home with the DNA results in my passenger seat like a bomb, and found Ethan's car already in the driveway. He was waiting in the kitchen when I walked in, his eyes red and swollen like he'd been crying, his whole body tense with this desperate, broken energy. He started talking before I could even put my keys down on the counter, begging me to let him explain, saying he knew I had the results, asking me to please just listen before I made any decisions. I stood there holding my purse and staring at this man I'd loved for 6 years, this man I'd married and built a life with, this man who'd watched me parent his secret child for 2 years while pretending to be a supportive uncle. I couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Just waited for him to fill the silence with his confession. He told me everything in this rushed, frantic voice like if he talked fast enough he could get through it before I stopped him. The bachelor party that was supposed to be camping, but they came back a day early because of rain. Getting drunk at his buddy's apartment. Amber showing up because she was in town visiting Rachel. One last hookup for old time's sake because he was scared about getting married and she was familiar and easy. He swore it meant nothing. Just fear and stupidity and too much whiskey. He didn't know about the pregnancy until a year after our wedding when Rachel came to him privately and told him Amber had his baby. Rachel begged him to let her raise the child as her own. Said Amber didn't want it, didn't want him to know, didn't want to ruin our marriage. Rachel wanted to be a mom so badly, and this was her chance. The baby would have a good home. I would never have to know. Everyone would win. Ethan said he was terrified of losing me, so he agreed. Let Rachel take the baby. Pretended it was a regular adoption. Acted like a normal uncle while watching me fall in love with his child. He kept saying he was sorry, that he never meant to hurt me, that Rachel convinced him this was the kindest option for everyone. I asked him how he could do it, how he could hold that baby in the hospital when Rachel brought them home, how he could watch me paint the nursery and buy tiny clothes and fall completely in love, how he could let me parent his son or daughter for 2 years while pretending this was just us helping family, how he could lie to my face every single day while I changed diapers and handled midnight fevers and taught his child to read. My voice stayed eerily calm while I asked these questions, and that seemed to scare him more than if I'd been screaming. He said Rachel convinced him it was better this way, that I got to be a mother after all our fertility struggles, that the child got a stable, loving family, that our marriage stayed intact. He said he thought he was protecting me from pain by keeping the secret, that he loved me and didn't want to lose me over one stupid mistake, that he'd been living with the guilt every day but convinced himself the child's happiness mattered more than the truth I told him our marriage wasn't intact. It was a performance I'd been giving without knowing I was acting. Every smile, every laugh, every moment of joy with that child had been built on his lies. I told him he needed to leave the house before I had to pick up his child from the school, because I couldn't look at him anymore without feeling sick. He tried to argue, stepping toward me with his hands out like he was going to touch me, but something in my voice made him stop. I just stared at him until he grabbed his keys off the counter and walked out the front door. The house went completely silent after his car pulled away. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the clock, watching the minutes tick down until I had to pick up the child 15 minutes to figure out how to smile at a 4-year-old. 15 minutes to bury the devastation deep enough that they wouldn't see it on my face. 15 minutes to become someone who could pretend everything was normal when nothing would ever be normal again. Picking up the child felt like moving through a dream. I pulled up to the preschool and waited in the pickup line with all the other parents, watching teachers guide kids to their cars. When the child saw me, they ran over with this huge smile, waving a painting they'd made in class. Some kind of rainbow with stick figures underneath that they explained was our family. They climbed into their car seat chattering about their day, about the game they played at recess, about the snack they had, completely unaware that their entire world was crumbling around them. I buckled them in and drove home on autopilot while they sang along to the radio in the back seat. When we got home, I held them tight in the driveway, breathing in the smell of their hair, feeling their small arms wrap around my neck. The horrible clarity hit me all at once. I loved this child completely. Regardless of biology, regardless of betrayal, regardless of how they came into my life, they were mine in every way that mattered. And that made everything so much worse because I could lose them. The law didn't care that I was the one who kissed their scraped knees and read bedtime stories and taught them to tie their shoes. Biology trumped love, and Ethan's DNA gave him rights I didn't have. That evening after the child fell asleep, I drove to Amber's apartment across town. She'd been hiding from this conversation for 4 years, and I deserved answers from the woman who gave birth and walked away. I'd only met her a handful of times at family gatherings where she played the role of Rachel's supportive friend who'd made a difficult choice. She always left early, always avoided holding the child, always had this guilty look in her eyes that I'd mistaken for sadness about giving up a baby. Now I knew it was shame. I knocked on her apartment door and she opened it looking absolutely terrified, like she'd been expecting this visit and dreading it. I didn't wait for an invitation, just pushed past her into the small living room and turned to face her. She started apologizing before I could say anything, words tumbling out in this panicked rush, but I cut her off. I wasn't here for apologies. I was here for the truth about what happened 4 years ago, and why she thought giving away Ethan's baby to his sister was an acceptable solution. Amber sat down on her couch and cried while she explained. She never wanted children, never felt any maternal instinct. The pregnancy was a nightmare she couldn't terminate because her family was deeply religious and would have disowned her. She was desperate and terrified, and when she told Rachel that Ethan was the father, Rachel saw an opportunity. Rachel had been trying to adopt through agencies for years with no success. This was her chance to be a mother. She promised to handle everything, to keep the secret, to give the baby a good life. Amber signed papers giving up all parental rights, walked away believing the child would be better off without her. She said she convinced herself it was the right choice, that Rachel would be a better mother than she could ever be, that Ethan and I would give the child a stable home eventually when Rachel got too sick, that everyone would be happier if she just disappeared. She said the guilt ate at her every day, but she was too much of a coward to tell the truth, too scared of what it would do to Rachel, to Ethan, to me, to the child. So she stayed quiet and watched from a distance while the lies built up into something that could destroy everyone. I asked her how she could watch me at every birthday party, every family dinner, every bedtime routine for 2 years and never feel the weight of what she was hiding. Amber looked at the floor and said she felt guilty every single day, but she convinced herself that the child's happiness mattered more than anyone's right to the truth. She said she told herself it was sacrifice, that she was protecting everyone. But sitting there in her apartment with me staring at her, she finally admitted it was just cowardice dressed up as something noble. She couldn't face what telling the truth would destroy, so she chose silence and called it love. I left without saying anything else because there was nothing left to hear from her. Cole called my phone at 7 the next morning while I was making the child's breakfast. His voice was careful and legal, the tone he probably used with clients who were about to hear bad news. He said we needed to talk about the legal reality of my situation, because it was worse than I understood. Rachel was the legal guardian through temporary custody papers that were supposed to become permanent adoption, but never did. Ethan was the biological father with DNA proof now. Amber had signed away all her parental rights 4 years ago. And me, the person who had been this child's mother in every way that counted for 2 years, I had no legal standing at all. 0. If Rachel died without updating her custody arrangements, Ethan would have the strongest claim to the child. I could lose them entirely, and the law would see it as a father claiming his biological kid, not as ripping a child away from their mother. Cole said the words slowly like he knew each one was hitting me in the chest. He said we needed to talk to Rachel immediately, today if possible, about formalizing custody arrangements while she was still mentally competent to make legal decisions. Which meant I had to go back to that apartment and confront a dying woman about fixing the disaster her lies created. The panic hit me so hard I had to sit down on the kitchen floor. The child asked if I was okay and I said yes, even though I felt like I was drowning in air. I'd been this child's mother for 2 years. I was the one who potty trained them and taught them their colors and held them when they had nightmares. I knew their favorite foods and they're scared of the dark routine and exactly how to cut their sandwich so they'd actually eat it. But none of that mattered to the law. Biology trumped love, and Ethan's DNA gave him rights I would never have. The child could be taken from me, and legally it would be considered reuniting a father with his kid. I called Cole back and told him we had to see Rachel today, right now, because I couldn't spend another minute knowing I might lose my child because of paperwork and secrets. He said he'd meet me at Rachel's apartment in 2 hours with the documents we needed. I dropped the child at Sloane's house and drove to Rachel's apartment that afternoon with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The hospice nurse let me in, and I found Rachel weaker than I'd ever seen her. She was trembling in her wheelchair by the window, her hands curled in her lap like claws, her face gray and thin. She started crying the second she saw me, saying she was sorry over and over in this broken voice that barely worked anymore. I told her that sorry didn't fix what she'd done to me, to the child, to everyone who believed her lies for 4 years. Sorry didn't give me back the choice I should have had. Sorry didn't undo 2 years of living inside a deception I didn't even know existed. She kept crying, and I just stood there watching her fall apart because I was too angry to comfort her and too sad to walk away. Rachel tried to explain through her tears and her failing voice. She said she was desperate to be a mother before her MS took everything from her, that when Amber told her about the pregnancy and who the father was, it felt like fate giving her one last chance. She convinced herself that keeping the paternity secret protected everyone. The child would have a family. I would never have to know about Ethan's betrayal. Ethan wouldn't have to face what he'd done, and she would get to be the mother she'd always wanted to be. She said she told Ethan the truth a year after our wedding because she needed his medical history for the child's records, and she was scared something genetic might matter someday. Ethan agreed to keep the secret because he was scared of losing me if I found out what happened the weekend before our wedding. Rachel said they both convinced themselves it was the kindest option for everyone, especially for me. She actually said that lying to me for years was kindness. I told her the truth would have hurt less than this betrayal. I could have maybe forgiven a confession, could have worked through knowing Ethan cheated and made a choice about our marriage with all the information, but I would never forgive years of watching me fall in love with a child while hiding whose child it really was. I would never forgive letting me believe I was helping family when really I was raising my husband's affair baby. I would never forgive the family gatherings where everyone played their parts in a lie I didn't know I was living. Rachel said she knew, that she'd thought about telling me 1,000 times, especially after I took the child in and became their primary parent. But she was selfish and scared, and she convinced herself that what I didn't know couldn't hurt me. She said she was wrong about everything, and now she was dying with the knowledge that she'd destroyed the people she loved most. Rachel had a medical crisis right there in front of me while we were talking. Her hands seized up completely, curling into fists she couldn't open. Her breathing became fast and shallow like she couldn't get enough air. The hospice nurse rushed over and checked her vitals and said we needed to call an ambulance right now. I watched the nurse make the call while Rachel struggled to breathe, and I knew I should leave. Should let the medical people handle this and go pick up my child from Sloane's. But I couldn't leave her alone. Despite everything she'd done, despite the lies and the betrayal and the years of deception, I couldn't watch her suffer alone. So I rode in the ambulance with her to the hospital, holding her twisted hand while she gasped for air. In the emergency room while doctors worked on her, she grabbed my hand with what little strength she had left and begged me to promise I'd take care of the child after she was gone. She said please over and over until they gave her oxygen and she couldn't talk anymore. I couldn't promise her anything in that moment. I was too angry and too hurt and too scared about what came next. But sitting in the hospital waiting room while they stabilized her, I realized that Rachel was dying, and the child was going to lose the only mother they'd legally known. Rachel had been Mama Rachel for 4 years. The child loved her even though I'd been doing the daily parenting for 2 years. When Rachel died, that legal protection died with her unless we fixed it. Now Cole showed up at the hospital an hour later with a briefcase full of documents. He said this was the time to have the hard conversations about custody, while Rachel was still lucid and before her condition got worse. He said we needed to act fast because MS could affect her mental capacity, and we needed her to sign papers while she could still legally make decisions. I felt sick about the timing, about having legal conversations with a dying woman, but I felt more sick about the possibility of losing my child. The next day, Rachel was stable enough for visitors and difficult conversations. Cole, Ethan, and I met in her hospital room with Rachel propped up in bed looking small and exhausted. Cole explained the legal options in his calm lawyer voice. Rachel could sign over guardianship to me and Ethan jointly, which would give us equal custody rights regardless of our marriage status. It would maintain the family structure the child knew and protect my role as their mother. Rachel agreed immediately, said yes before Cole even finished explaining, like she'd been waiting for permission to fix what she'd broken. But I told her I didn't know if I could stay married to Ethan. I couldn't promise to raise this child with a man who'd lied to me for years. Rachel started crying again, and Cole said the guardianship didn't require us to stay married, just to co-parent legally. Ethan broke down completely right there in the hospital room. He said he knew he'd destroyed everything, that he'd been a coward and a liar and he didn't deserve forgiveness or second chances. But he loved me, and he loved the child, and he was begging for a chance to rebuild trust even though he knew he had no right to ask. He said he'd do anything, therapy, complete honesty, whatever I needed, just please don't give up on us. I looked at him crying, and I felt nothing but exhaustion. I told him I couldn't think about our marriage when I was trying to figure out how to protect a child from losing everything stable in their life. The child needed parents who could work together even if those parents couldn't be married anymore. I said we'd deal with the legal stuff first and figure out our relationship later if there was anything left to figure out. Rachel signed the guardianship papers that afternoon with her shaking hands, barely able to hold the pen. Cole witnessed it and filed everything immediately. I walked out of that hospital room legally recognized as my child's guardian, and it should have felt like victory, but it just felt like surviving. The child was asleep when I got home from the hospital that night, curled up in bed with their favorite stuffed animal clutched tight. I stood in the doorway watching them breathe, and for the first time since Rachel told me the truth, I felt something besides anger. Relief, maybe, that the papers were signed and legal protection existed between me and losing this person I loved, but also grief, because needing legal protection meant everything was broken in ways I didn't know how to fix. The next morning, the child woke up screaming from a nightmare they couldn't explain, just crying and shaking in my arms while I held them and promised everything was okay, even though it wasn't. That became the pattern over the next week. Bad dreams every night, sometimes multiple times, and the child would wake up terrified and need me to sit with them until they fell back asleep. During the day, they started clinging to me constantly, following me from room to room, panicking if I went to the bathroom alone. I couldn't leave their sight without them getting upset, which made simple things like grocery shopping or taking a shower feel impossible. Their preschool teacher called me on a Thursday afternoon and asked if everything was all right at home because the child had hit another kid during circle time for no reason. Anyone could figure out. Then they'd cried for 20 minutes and wouldn't tell the teacher what was wrong, just kept asking when I was coming to pick them up. The teacher said this wasn't normal behavior for them, that they'd always been gentle and happy, and she was worried something had happened. I told her we were going through some family stuff and I'd handle it. But sitting in my car after that call, I realized we were failing. The adults were so busy dealing with betrayal and custody and dying that we'd forgotten to protect the one person who mattered most. The child knew something was wrong even though we hadn't told them anything specific, and their whole world felt unstable because the grown-ups they trusted were acting strange and tense. I called Cole that afternoon and asked if he knew a child psychologist because I needed help. I didn't know how to give. He recommended someone named Verity Burnett, who specialized in family transitions and trauma, and I made an appointment for the next day because waiting felt dangerous. Verity's office was in a converted house with toys in the waiting room and colorful paintings on the walls, designed to feel safe and not scary for kids. She met with me alone first while the child played in the waiting area with the receptionist, and I explained the situation as simply as I could. The child had been living with me for 2 years thinking I was their aunt, but I was actually raising them while their mother who had MS got sicker, and now there was custody stuff happening and adults were stressed and the child was falling apart. Verity listened without judging and said she'd need to evaluate the child to understand what they were experiencing and what kind of support they needed. The evaluation took about an hour with Verity and the child playing with toys and drawing pictures, while Verity asked gentle questions about feelings and family and what made them scared or happy. I sat in the waiting room trying not to imagine what the child might be saying or revealing, just hoping Verity could give me answers about how to fix this. When they came out, the child ran to me and climbed into my lap like they always did now, and Verity asked if we could talk while the child colored at the table nearby. She explained that the child was experiencing anxiety from household instability, that kids this age were incredibly sensitive to adult emotions and tension, even when nothing was said out loud. They could sense that something was wrong with the grown-ups they depended on, and that made their whole world feel unsafe. The nightmares and clinginess and acting out were all symptoms of that anxiety, their way of trying to control a situation that felt out of control. Verity said children this age didn't need details about adult problems, but they needed reassurance that the adults they loved weren't going anywhere. They needed consistency and routine and calm, stable grown-ups who could make them feel safe even when things were changing. I asked her how I was supposed to promise the child that nothing would change when everything already had, when their legal mother was dying, and their biological father was my husband, who I might divorce. Verity said I didn't have to promise nothing would change, just that I would always be there, and they would always be loved and taken care of, no matter what else happened. She recommended maintaining the child's routine as much as possible, having both me and Ethan present for important parts of their day, like bedtime, and being physically affectionate and verbally reassuring even when it felt fake. She also suggested I might benefit from therapy myself to process everything I was dealing with, because kids picked up on parental stress, and I needed to find ways to be calm around them even when I was falling apart. Inside, Ethan was staying with his parents across town, but I called him after the appointment and told him what Verity said about maintaining consistency. He asked if he could come over every evening for the child's bedtime routine, and I said yes, even though the thought of seeing him daily made my stomach hurt. The child needed stability more than I needed distance from my lying husband, so we'd figure out how to be civil for an hour every night. That evening, Ethan showed up at 7 like we'd agreed, and the child lit up when they saw him in a way that made my heart hurt. They ran to him and he picked them up and spun them around, and for those few seconds everything looked normal and happy like it used to be. We did bath time and pajamas and story time together, taking turns reading pages and tucking blankets and kissing the child goodnight. The whole time we were both performing normalcy, smiling and laughing and acting like everything was fine, and it was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Being in the same room with Ethan, watching him be gentle and loving with the child, remembering that he'd lied to me every single day for years while I fell in love with his kid. The moment the child fell asleep, Ethan left without us speaking beyond basic coordination about the routine. No goodbyes, no small talk, just him walking out the door, and me standing in the kitchen alone feeling like I'd been holding my breath for an hour that became our new normal over the next 2 weeks. Ethan coming over every evening at 7, us co-parenting through bedtime with fake smiles and careful politeness, then him leaving the second the child was asleep and me collapsing from the effort of pretending it was torture, but it was working because the child's nightmares started happening less often, and they seemed calmer during the day, less clingy and anxious. The preschool teacher called again to say they'd had a good week with no incidents, and I felt like maybe we were protecting them from the worst of the adult chaos. Even if it was killing me, I told Sloan about the hostile co-parenting arrangement over coffee one afternoon while the child was at preschool, and she asked how I was handling being around Ethan every day. I said I didn't know how to separate my rage at him from my need to give the child stability, that every time I looked at him I wanted to scream, but I also needed him to show up and be a good father figure because the child loved him. Sloan said maybe I didn't have to figure that out yet, that maybe it was okay to put my marriage in one box, and my role as the child's mother in another box, and only open the marriage box when I was ready. She suggested I focus on being the child's mother first, and Ethan's wife second, and that gave me permission to stop trying to process everything at once. I could be angry at my husband later, but right now I needed to be a stable parent, and those were 2 separate jobs I could do one at a time. 2 weeks after the DNA results arrived, I drove to my parents' house because I needed their support, and they deserved to know why their son-in-law might not be at family dinners anymore. I'd been avoiding telling them because saying it out loud to my parents felt like making it more real, but I couldn't keep hiding something this big. They were in the kitchen making dinner when I arrived, and I sat at the table where I'd eaten 1,000 meals growing up and told them everything. About Rachel's confession, and Ethan's affair, and the DNA test, and the custody papers, and how I was raising my husband's child from another woman while trying to figure out if my marriage was worth saving. My mother started crying immediately, the kind of quiet tears that meant she was devastated but trying to hold it together for me. My father got angry in that quiet, scary way he had where his jaw tightened and his voice dropped and you knew he was furious but controlling it. He asked if Ethan had apologized and I said yes. He'd apologized and begged and promised to do better. But I didn't know if sorry was enough. My mother asked what I needed from them, and I said I just needed to know they'd support whatever I decided about my marriage. That if I stayed or if I left, they'd still love me and help with the child. They both promised immediately and fiercely that they'd support any decision I made, that I was their daughter, and the child was their grandchild now, regardless of biology, and they'd be there for whatever came next. My father said if I wanted him to have a conversation with Ethan, he would, in that tone that implied the conversation wouldn't be gentle. I told him no, that Ethan and I had to figure this out ourselves. But knowing my parents were on my side made me feel less alone in the disaster. Meanwhile, Ethan finally confessed everything to his parents, and I got a phone call from Ava crying and apologizing for her son and begging me not to take away her grandchild. She said she was horrified by what Ethan had done, that she'd raised him better than that, but the child was still her grandchild, and she loved them so much, and please don't cut them out of the family. I told her I wasn't the one who created this disaster, and I wasn't trying to take anyone's grandchild away, but she needed to understand that I was the child's mother now, and I'd make decisions about what was best for them. Her begging made me furious because she was treating me like the villain when Ethan was the one who'd cheated and lied for years. I said we could talk about visitation and family involvement later, but right now I needed space to figure out my life, and I hung up before she could cry at me anymore. The next day, Kylie showed up at my door unannounced, and when I opened it, she hugged me before saying anything. She told me she'd heard everything from their parents, and she thought her brother was a selfish coward who didn't deserve me. She said she'd always liked me better than Ethan anyway, and she'd support me no matter what I decided about the marriage. If I stayed, she'd help however she could, and if I left, she'd still be the child's aunt and my friend. Her loyalty felt like a lifeline, because I'd lost so much family trust, and having someone from Ethan's side believe me and choose me meant more than I could explain. Kylie said their parents were struggling with the news, but they'd come around eventually, and in the meantime, she was here for me and the child. Whenever we needed her, Rachel got released from the hospital after a week, but her decline was rapid and obvious now. She could barely use her hands, her speech was slurred and hard to understand, and the hospice nurse who came to her apartment daily said we were looking at weeks, not months. I brought the child to visit her every few days because she was still their mama Rachel, and they deserved to say goodbye, even if they didn't understand what goodbye meant. Watching them together broke my heart in complicated ways, because Rachel loved that child so much and the child loved her back, and none of that was fake even though the foundation was built on lies. During one visit while the child played with toys in the living room, Rachel pulled me aside into her bedroom and told me she'd updated her will. She was leaving me everything, her savings account and her life insurance policy, and everything she owned, because she wanted to make sure the child was provided for after she was gone. I told her I didn't want her money, that what I wanted was the years of honesty she'd stolen from me, but she said this was the only way she could make amends now. She said the life insurance was $50,000 and it should go toward the child's future, their education, or whatever they needed, because she couldn't be there to provide for them herself. I wanted to refuse it, to tell her to leave her money to charity, or Ethan, or anyone else, but I knew the child would need that money someday, and my pride wasn't worth hurting their future. So I said okay, and thank you, and I'm still angry at you. And Rachel said she knew, and she was sorry, and she hoped someday I could forgive her, even though she didn't deserve it. 2 days after signing Rachel's will documents, my phone buzzed with a text from Ethan asking if we could talk about our marriage. Not the child or Rachel or the legal mess, just us. I stared at the message for 10 minutes before typing back that we could meet at the coffee shop on Main Street because I couldn't have this conversation in our home where the child might overhear. He replied immediately saying he'd be there in an hour. I dropped the child at Sloane's house without explaining why, just saying I needed to run an errand and drove to the coffee shop with my stomach in knots. Ethan was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee he'd ordered for us, and he looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. He said he understood I was angry and I had every right to be, but he was asking me to consider that people make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes define them and sometimes they don't. I told him his mistake had defined our entire marriage, because everything we'd built was based on a lie he'd been living with for 4 years. He started crying right there in the coffee shop, and I felt nothing watching his tears because I'd cried so much over the past weeks that I had no sympathy left for his pain. We sat there for another 20 minutes while he talked about how much he loved me and how sorry he was, and I drank my coffee and thought about how strange it was that I could still love someone I didn't trust anymore. When I left the coffee shop, I didn't promise him anything except that I'd think about what he said, which was more than he deserved, but less than he wanted. The next morning, Ava and her husband showed up at my door unannounced, not even calling first, just ringing the doorbell at 8 in the morning while I was getting the child ready for preschool. I opened the door and Ava pushed past me into the hallway saying they needed to discuss custody arrangements immediately because they were the child's biological grandparents. And they had rights too. Her husband followed her inside without being invited, and stood there with his arms crossed like he was ready for a fight. I told them very calmly that they could discuss custody with Cole, because I wasn't negotiating my child's future on my doorstep, and if they didn't leave right now, I'd call the police for trespassing. Ava started crying and saying I was trying to keep their grandchild away from them, that they'd done nothing wrong and shouldn't be punished for Ethan's mistakes. I told her that showing up at my house demanding things wasn't about the child, it was about control, and their sense of entitlement to make demands made me understand exactly where Ethan learned to put his own needs above everyone else's honesty. Her husband started to argue, but I opened the door and pointed outside, and something in my face must have convinced them I was serious, because they left. The child came downstairs asking who was at the door, and I told them it was nobody important, just some people who got lost and we needed to hurry or we'd be late for school. After I dropped the child off, I called Cole and told him what happened, and he said he'd handle it, and I should not engage with them directly anymore. Cole sent Ava and her husband a formal letter that afternoon explaining that Rachel's guardianship designation legally superseded grandparent rights, and unless they wanted to challenge a dying woman's wishes in court and explain to a judge why they thought they knew better than the mother who'd raised this child, they needed to back off immediately. He also pointed out that their son was the biological father with stronger legal standing than they had, so any custody fight would be between me and Ethan, not them, and their interference was only making things worse for everyone, including their grandchild. Cole called me that evening to say they'd received the letter and responded through their own lawyer saying they'd respect Rachel's wishes, but wanted scheduled visitation with their grandchild. I told Cole to tell them we'd discuss visitation after Rachel passed, and the legal guardianship was finalized. Not before. because I wasn't making any promises while everything was still uncertain. The damage to family relationships was permanent now, and I knew it. Holidays would never be the same. Family dinners would never be comfortable. The child would grow up knowing their family was broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. I thought about how Rachel's secret had destroyed so much more than just my marriage. It had fractured an entire extended family, and even if everyone eventually moved forward, the cracks would always be visible. I started seeing Gwendolyn Garcia, a family therapist Cole recommended, alone at first because I needed help processing the betrayal and figuring out what I wanted before I could even think about couples counseling with Ethan. Her office was in a quiet building downtown with comfortable chairs and soft lighting that was supposed to make people feel safe enough to fall apart. In our first session, I told her everything, the whole horrible story, and she listened without interrupting or judging. When I finished, she asked me what I wanted most right now, and I realized I didn't know anymore, because everything I'd thought I wanted had been based on lies. She helped me understand that I could be furious at Ethan while still loving the child completely, that these feelings didn't contradict each other. They just existed side by side in the complicated mess of real life. She said my maternal bond was real regardless of how it was formed, that 2 years of daily caregiving and unconditional love mattered more than biology or legal documents. I cried in her office for the first time since the revelation, because someone finally understood that I wasn't confused about loving the child, I was confused about everything else. She gave me homework, actual assignments like writing down what I needed from Ethan to even consider staying married and what I needed for myself, regardless of whether the marriage survived. I left her office feeling like maybe I could figure this out. Like maybe having someone help me untangle the mess would make it possible to see a path forward. 3 weeks after the revelation, I was at the grocery store buying milk and cereal when I suddenly felt dizzy and sick to my stomach in the middle of the dairy aisle. I barely made it to the bathroom before throwing up, leaning over the toilet in the public restroom while other shoppers walked in and out. When I finally stopped being sick, I washed my face and stared at myself in the mirror, trying to figure out what was wrong with me. Then I realized my period was late. Really late. Like 2 weeks late, and my stomach dropped because I knew what that meant. I walked back into the store on shaking legs and found the pharmacy section, grabbed a pregnancy test without really thinking about it, and paid for it along with my groceries like I was on autopilot. I couldn't wait to get home. I went back to the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and took the test right there with my grocery bags sitting outside the door. 3 minutes later, I was staring at 2 pink lines that meant everything was about to get even more complicated. I sat on the toilet in that grocery store bathroom holding a positive pregnancy test and feeling like the universe was playing the cruelest joke possible. I was pregnant with Ethan's child, actually planned and wanted from months ago, when we'd been trying and hopeful, right in the middle of this nightmare about his other child. The timing was so horrible I almost laughed sitting there in that bathroom stall. We'd done fertility treatments for over a year with no success, and now when our marriage was falling apart and I didn't even know if I wanted to stay with him, my body decided to finally cooperate. I shoved the test in my purse and walked out to my car carrying my groceries, and I sat in the parking lot trying to figure out how I felt about this. Part of me was happy, because I'd wanted to be pregnant for so long, wanted to carry a baby and give birth and experience that whole journey I'd been denied. But another part of me was terrified because this baby deserved better than being born into chaos and uncertainty, and parents who might not stay together. I put my hands on my still flat stomach, and thought about the tiny person growing inside me who had no idea what kind of mess they were arriving into. I couldn't go home yet, because the child would be there with the babysitter, and I needed time to process this alone. So I just sat in my car in the grocery store parking lot, watching people come and go with their shopping carts, living their normal, uncomplicated lives, while mine kept getting more tangled. I drove straight to Sloane's house without calling first because I needed to tell someone before I exploded from keeping this secret. She opened the door and took one look at my face and pulled me inside, and I started crying before I even sat down. I told her about the pregnancy between sobs, how this should be the happiest news, but instead it was complicated by betrayal and terrible timing, and not knowing if my marriage would survive. She held me on her couch while I cried and didn't say anything for a long time, just let me get it all out. When I finally stopped crying, she asked if I was going to tell Ethan, and I said I had to because he was the father, but I didn't know how to tell him without it feeling like another trap. She said pregnancy wasn't a trap. It was a reality we had to deal with, and Ethan deserved to know even if our marriage was broken. I asked her if she thought I was crazy for even considering staying with him after everything he'd done, and she said no. She thought I was human, and humans were messy and complicated, and sometimes love survived things it shouldn't. She made me tea, and we talked for another hour about what this pregnancy meant and how I was going to handle it. And by the time I left, I felt steadier, like maybe I could face telling Ethan without completely falling apart. I told Ethan that evening after the child was asleep, just blurting it out in the kitchen because there was no good way to announce a pregnancy during a marital crisis. He was loading the dishwasher from dinner, and I was wiping down the counters, and I just stopped and said, I needed to tell him something important. He turned around looking worried like he thought I was about to ask for a divorce, and I said I was pregnant. He stared at me for a long moment, not saying anything, and then he started crying, actually sobbing while standing there holding a plate. He said this was what we'd wanted for so long, what we'd tried so hard for, and it was finally happening. I told him not to act like this fixed anything between us because a baby didn't erase betrayal or rebuild trust. He put the plate down and tried to hug me, but I stepped back because I wasn't ready for that kind of physical comfort from him. He asked how far along I was, and I said about 6 weeks based on my last period, which meant I'd gotten pregnant right before Rachel told me the truth, back when I still thought my marriage was solid. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Ethan asked if I was going to keep the baby, and I told him that wasn't a question he got to ask because this was my body, and my decision. And yes, I was keeping the baby, but not because of him. He said he didn't mean it like that. He just wanted to know what I was thinking and feeling. I told him I was thinking our timing was terrible, and I was feeling scared and angry and happy all at once. He said he wanted to be there for this pregnancy, to go to doctor appointments and be involved and support me however I needed. I told him we'd see about that because I couldn't promise him anything right now. Not about the pregnancy or our marriage or our future. He said he understood, and he'd take whatever involvement I was willing to give him. We stood there in the kitchen not touching, both of us thinking about the baby growing inside me and how different this moment should have been. I should have been excited to tell my husband we were finally pregnant. He should have been able to celebrate without the weight of his betrayal hanging between us. Instead, we were two broken people trying to figure out how to bring a new life into our broken family. Rachel's condition got much worse very suddenly, like her body had been holding on until the legal paperwork was done, and now it was giving up. The hospice nurse called me 3 days after I found out about the pregnancy to say Rachel was having trouble breathing and couldn't eat solid food anymore, and we should prepare to say goodbye soon. I brought the child to see her one last time, explaining in the car that Mama Rachel was very sick, and we needed to be gentle with her. Rachel was in bed when we arrived, propped up on pillows with an oxygen tube in her nose, and she looked so small and frail that the child hesitated in the doorway. I encouraged them forward, and they climbed carefully onto the bed next to Rachel, who wrapped one shaking arm around them. Rachel told the child she loved them so much, more than anything in the whole world, and that I was going to take such good care of them after she was gone. The child asked where she was going, and Rachel said she was going to be an angel watching over them forever. The child started crying without really understanding why, just sensing that something final was happening, and Rachel cried too, while holding them close. I stood at the foot of the bed watching this goodbye and feeling my own complicated grief, anger and sadness and love all mixed together for this woman who'd given me motherhood wrapped in lies. The child hugged Rachel goodbye, and I walked them out to the nurse who would take them to the playroom, then returned to Rachel's bedside and sat in the chair I'd been living in for the past week. Rachel looked at me with those tired eyes and reached for my hand with fingers that barely worked anymore. She told me she was grateful I'd be the one raising her baby because I was a better mother than she could have been even without the MS. I told her that didn't excuse what she did. She said she knew, that she'd die knowing she hurt the people she loved most, and she was sorry she wouldn't be here to help me through what came next. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just held her hand and watched her chest rise and fall with the oxygen machine doing most of the work. 3 days later, the hospice nurse called at 4 a.m. to say Rachel's breathing had changed, and we should come now. I called Ethan from the guest room where he'd been sleeping, and we drove to the facility in silence. Rachel was unconscious when we arrived, her breathing shallow and rattling in a way that made my stomach hurt. The nurse said it would be soon, maybe hours, and we should say whatever we needed to say. Ethan sat on one side of the bed and I sat on the other, and we each held one of Rachel's hands. Ethan told her he was sorry for everything, and he'd take care of her baby forever. I told her I'd make sure the child knew how much she loved them. Rachel's eyes opened for just a moment, and she looked at me and whispered that she hoped I could forgive her someday, even if I couldn't now. Then her breathing got slower and slower, and then it stopped. The nurse checked for a pulse and shook her head and wrote down the time. I sat there holding Rachel's still warm hand and thinking about how she'd given me motherhood wrapped in lies, and I'd never know if I should thank her or hate her for it. I had to tell the child that same morning because they kept asking when we'd visit Mama Rachel again. I sat them down on the couch and explained that Mama Rachel's body stopped working and she wasn't coming back. The child looked confused at first and then started crying and asking if I was going to leave too. I pulled them into my lap and promised I wasn't going anywhere, that I was their mom now and forever, and I meant it with every part of my heart. They cried for an hour while I held them and rocked them and tried not to cry myself because I needed to be strong for them. That night they crawled into my bed and slept curled against me, and I lay awake thinking about how this child had lost the only mother they'd legally known and didn't even understand what death meant. Rachel's funeral was 5 days later in a small chapel near her apartment. Half the family knew the truth by then, and the other half could sense something was wrong from the way people weren't talking to each other. I sat between Sloane and Kylie with the child on my lap, and Ethan sat with his parents across the aisle. The physical distance between us felt like a map of everything broken. The service was short because Rachel didn't want anything fancy. The child asked why everyone was sad, and I told them we were saying goodbye to Mama Rachel one last time. They didn't understand, but they stayed quiet on my lap and played with my necklace while the minister talked about Rachel's strength and love. After the service, everyone gathered in the chapel hall for coffee and sad sandwiches. Ava approached me while I was getting the child a cookie and told me she was sorry for how she handled things. She said she was scared of losing her grandchild, and she reacted badly. I told her she hadn't lost anyone, that I wasn't trying to cut off the child's family, but she needed to respect that I was the mother now and decisions went through me. She nodded and said she understood, and could she please still see the child sometimes? I said yes because the child loved their grandparents, and I wouldn't take that away just because the adults had made everything complicated. 2 days after the funeral, I met Cole at his office to file the paperwork for the guardianship transfer. He had forms spread across his desk and explained each one while I signed my name over and over. He said I should consider adopting the child formally to strengthen my legal position. Now that Rachel was gone, I asked how long that would take, and he said 6 months minimum, maybe longer. With home studies and background checks and court hearings, I told him to start the process immediately, because I needed the law to recognize what my heart already knew. This was my child. Biology didn't matter. Ethan's betrayal didn't matter. What mattered was 2 years of daily parenting, and a love that had nothing to do with DNA. A week after Rachel's death, I agreed to meet with Ethan and Gwendolyn for a mediation session about our marriage. We sat in her office with a box of tissues between us, and she asked what we each wanted. Ethan said he wanted to move back home and work on our relationship. I said I needed more time to figure out if I could ever trust him again. Gwendolyn asked what trust would look like for me, and I said I didn't know yet, that every time I looked at him I saw 4 years of lies. Ethan started crying and said he'd do anything to fix this. I told him I wasn't sure anything could fix it, but I was willing to try therapy if he was serious about changing. During that same session, Gwendolyn asked about the pregnancy and how that factored into our decision-making. I told her the pregnancy didn't change anything about his betrayal, that I wouldn't stay married just to give the baby a 2-parent household if the marriage was broken. Ethan said he understood, but he was asking me to try couples therapy, to give him a chance to prove he could be the husband I deserved. I looked at him across that office and saw the man I'd married, and the man who'd lied to me for 4 years, and I didn't know which one was real. But I agreed to couples counseling because I still loved him, even though I didn't like him much right now, and maybe that was enough to start with. We started seeing Gwendolyn together twice a week, and the sessions were brutal. Ethan had to sit with how much damage his lies caused while I had to admit that I still loved him, despite everything she made us do exercises where we had to say what we needed from each other without blaming or attacking. Ethan needed me to believe he could change. I needed him to understand that trust took years to build and seconds to destroy. She taught us communication tools about using I statements and taking breaks when conversations got too heated. She helped us separate our marriage issues from our co-parenting responsibilities so we could still work together for the child, even when we were mad at each other. It was hard work, and some days I left her office feeling worse than when I arrived, but slowly we started talking to each other like people again instead of enemies. 2 months after Rachel's death, I was 12 weeks pregnant and starting to show. I was making breakfast when the child came into the kitchen and stared at my belly and asked if there was a baby in there. I told them yes. They were going to be a big sibling. They got so excited they started jumping up and down and asking when the baby would come and if it would be a boy or girl, and could they help pick the name. I cried because this innocent joy was what I'd wanted pregnancy to feel like, not the complicated mess of emotions I'd been carrying. The child hugged my belly and told the baby they were going to teach them everything and be the best big sibling ever. I looked at this child who'd come into my life through lies and betrayal and realized they'd given me more than I'd given them. They'd made me a mother before biology did, and that gift was worth all the pain that came with it. A week later, I was making lunch when the child wandered into the kitchen and wrapped their arms around my legs and said, "I love you, Mommy." Like it was the most natural thing in the world, I froze with the sandwich halfway to the plate because they'd never called me that before. Always Aunt. Even though I'd been doing all the mom things for 2 years, Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table and he looked up and our eyes met, and he smiled at me with this sad, hopeful expression that made my chest hurt. I smiled back because in that moment, we weren't a betrayed wife and a cheating husband. We were just 2 people who loved this child and wanted them to be happy. The child didn't notice any of the adult emotions swirling around them, just squeezed my legs tighter and asked what was for lunch. I told them grilled cheese and they cheered and ran off to wash their hands, and I stood there with tears running down my face while Ethan got up and handed me a tissue without saying anything. 2 days later, Ethan asked if he could come to my next ultrasound appointment, and I said yes, because despite everything, this was his baby too, and I didn't want to punish the child I was carrying for their father's mistakes. The appointment was at 10 on a Thursday, and Ethan met me in the parking lot, and we walked in together without touching. The waiting room was full of pregnant women with their partners, and I felt weird sitting next to Ethan like we were a normal couple when we weren't really anything anymore. The ultrasound technician called my name, and we went back to the exam room and I lay down on the table and pulled up my shirt. The gel was cold, and the technician moved the wand around on my belly, and suddenly there was the baby on the screen, moving and kicking and so real. Ethan made this choked sound and reached for my hand, and I let him hold it because in that moment I wanted him there. The technician found the heartbeat and it filled the room, steady and strong, and Ethan started crying silently with his hand gripped tight around mine. I was crying too because this baby was ours, made on purpose, wanted and planned, and it felt like the first good thing in months. The appointment lasted 20 minutes, and afterward we sat in my car in the parking lot, and Ethan thanked me for letting him be there. I told him I was doing it for the baby, not for him, and he said he knew, but he was grateful anyway. 3 months after Rachel's death, I told Ethan he could move back into the house but into the guest room, because I wasn't ready to share a bed with him yet. He showed up the next day with 2 suitcases and a hopeful expression, and I showed him to the guest room down the hall from our old bedroom. The child was thrilled to have him back, jumping up and down and hugging his legs and chattering about how they could all have breakfast together. Now Ethan set up his things in the guest room while I made dinner, and it felt strange having him in the house again after months of him being gone. That first week was awkward and careful, both of us moving around each other like we might break something if we got too close. But it was also easier because the child was happier with both of us there, and co-parenting in the same space meant less exhausting handoffs and schedules. Ethan did bedtime routine every night and made breakfast every morning, and we split the other tasks without discussing it much. We still weren't really talking about us, just about the child and the house and practical things, but it was better than the hostile silence of before. In therapy the next week, Gwendolyn asked how the new living arrangement was working, and I told her it was okay. Strange, but okay. She asked if I'd thought about what I wanted long-term, and I said I was still figuring it out. Ethan said he'd wait as long as I needed, that he knew he had to earn back my trust, and that would take time. I looked at him across the therapy room and realized I'd made a decision without fully admitting it to myself. I told Gwendolyn and Ethan that I was choosing to keep my marriage but on completely new terms. Complete transparency about everything, continued therapy for as long as we needed it, and understanding that trust would take years to rebuild. Ethan agreed immediately to everything, and told me he'd spend the rest of his life proving I made the right choice. I told him I wasn't doing this for him. I was doing it because I still loved him despite everything and because our children deserved parents who tried. Gwendolyn said that was a healthy foundation to start from, and we spent the rest of the session talking about what transparency looked like in practice. 4 months after Rachel's death, Cole called to say the adoption hearing was scheduled, and I needed to be at the courthouse at 9 the next Tuesday. I took the day off work and dressed carefully in a navy dress that hid my growing belly and drove downtown to the family court building. Ethan met me there, and we went through security together and found the right courtroom. The judge was a woman in her 50s who smiled at me kindly and asked me to explain why I was petitioning to adopt. I told her I'd been the child's primary caregiver for 2 years, that Rachel had wanted me to raise them, that I loved them completely, and wanted to make it legal and permanent. The judge asked Ethan if he consented to the adoption, and he said yes without hesitation. She asked if there were any other parties with parental rights, and Cole explained that Amber had terminated her rights years ago, and Rachel had passed away. The judge reviewed the paperwork for what felt like forever, and then she signed the adoption decree and congratulated me. Walking out of the courthouse with that paper in my hands felt like the first solid ground I'd stood on since this nightmare began. The child was officially, legally, permanently mine, and no one could take them away. Ethan hugged me in the parking lot, and I let him because this was a good day, and I wanted to share it. At 20 weeks, I had another ultrasound to check the baby's growth and find out the gender if we wanted. Ethan came with me again, and this time we held hands in the waiting room without it feeling so strange. The technician did all the measurements and then asked if we wanted to know what we were having. I said yes, and Ethan squeezed my hand tight. The technician smiled and said, "Congratulations. You're having a daughter." Ethan started crying again, and I felt this rush of joy because I was getting a daughter, and the child was getting a sister, and maybe we really could be a family. That evening we told the child they were getting a baby sister, and they got so excited they started jumping on the couch and asking a million questions. Over the next few weeks, the child helped me set up the nursery, picking out pink curtains and a mobile with stars and a stuffed elephant for the crib. I'd catch them talking to my belly and telling the baby about all the things they'd teach her, and it made me believe we could actually rebuild something good from all this pain. In therapy one afternoon, I finally told Ethan what had hurt the most. I said the affair was bad, but the years of lying while watching me love his child, that was what destroyed me. He sat there crying and said he was a coward who took the easy path and destroyed everything good in his life. He said he'd never forgive himself even if I eventually did, and that vulnerability cracked something open in me. I reached across the space between our chairs and took his hand and told him I was trying to forgive him, but it was hard and slow, and some days I still wanted to scream at him. He said he understood and he'd take whatever I could give him. Gwendolyn said we were making real progress, and that honesty was the foundation we needed to rebuild on. 5 months after the revelation, I was getting ready for bed when Ethan appeared in the doorway of the master bedroom. He asked if he could sleep in here tonight. Not as a permanent thing, but just tonight because he missed me. I looked at him standing there, nervous and hopeful, and I said, "Okay." We got into bed on opposite sides and lay there in the dark, not touching, and it was awkward and emotional and not perfect, but it was a start. Ethan moved closer and put his arm around me carefully like I might break, and I let him because I was tired of being angry all the time, and I wanted to believe people could change. We didn't have sex, just held each other, and I fell asleep feeling less alone than I had in months. The next morning, Ava called and asked if she and her husband could come over to talk. They arrived that afternoon and sat on my couch looking nervous, and I braced myself for another fight. Instead, Ava asked if they could be involved grandparents to both children, to the one I'd adopted and to the daughter I was carrying. She said she knew they'd handled everything badly, but they loved their grandchild, and they wanted to be part of both kids' lives if I'd let them. I told them yes to regular visits and family dinners because the child loved them, and my daughter would need grandparents too. I also told them the relationships were different now, more careful with clearer boundaries, but if they respected those boundaries, we could rebuild something. Ava cried and thanked me, and her husband nodded and said they'd do better. It wasn't perfect, and there was still tension under the surface, but it was rebuilding, and that was enough for now. When the child started pre-K, their teacher called me in for a conference after the first week. She said the child had told the class during circle time that they had two mommies, one who died and one who was here now. The teacher wanted to make sure she understood the family situation correctly, so she could support the child appropriately. I explained about Rachel and the adoption, and the teacher nodded and said the child seemed to have integrated it all in a really healthy way. Driving home, I realized the child had found a way to honor both Rachel and me, to hold space for the mother who gave them life and the mother who was raising them. They knew they were loved by Rachel and they were loved by me, and that was a gift I could give them even though Rachel's deception still hurt. At 7 months pregnant, my body felt huge and awkward, but Ethan started planning something that surprised me. He asked if we could do a vow renewal ceremony in our backyard with just immediate family, something small and meaningful to mark us choosing each other again after everything. I said yes because we'd been doing the therapy work and sleeping in the same bed again, and I wanted to believe we could rebuild something real. He spent 2 weeks getting the backyard ready, hanging string lights and setting up chairs under the big oak tree, and he wrote new vows that he practiced in the bathroom when he thought I couldn't hear. The ceremony happened on a Saturday afternoon with just my parents, his parents, Kylie, Sloan, and Cole, and the child who wore a fancy outfit and took their job as ring bearer very seriously. Ethan's vows promised honesty and transparency and earning back my trust every single day for the rest of our lives, and his voice broke when he said he knew he didn't deserve another chance, but he'd spend forever proving I made the right choice. I wrote vows acknowledging that our marriage wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and we were choosing each other again with open eyes this time, knowing exactly what we were getting into, and deciding it was worth the work. The child clapped when we kissed, and everyone cried a little, and afterward we had cake in the backyard while the sun set, and it felt like maybe we really could make this work. 2 weeks later, Sloan threw me a baby shower that doubled as a celebration of the adoption being finalized, and she decorated with 2 themes blended together because both my children deserved to be honored. The invitation said we were celebrating the family I'd built through love, not biology. And when I walked into Sloan's house and saw all the decorations and the 2 cakes, one saying big sibling and one saying baby sister, I cried before I even sat down. The child helped me open every present, carefully pulling off bows and folding paper, and they got so excited about each tiny outfit and baby toy that everyone kept commenting on what a good big sibling they were going to be. They kept putting their hand on my belly and telling everyone about our baby and how they were going to teach her everything important. Sloan gave a speech about how family is what you make it and how proud she was of me for fighting for both my children. And I looked around the room at the people who'd shown up through everything and felt grateful in a way that hurt because it had cost so much to get here. The child ate 3 pieces of cake and fell asleep in my lap during present opening, and I held them while people chatted around us and thought about how this was the family we'd become. Kylie found me alone in Sloan's kitchen after the shower, helping clean up while everyone else was in the living room. She told me she was proud of me for setting boundaries and making Ethan work for forgiveness instead of just taking him back the easy way. She said she'd watched too many women in their family accept apologies without requiring real change, and seeing me demand better had changed how she thought about her own relationships. I told her she'd been the aunt who really showed up when things got hard, who chose truth over family loyalty, and that mattered more than blood. She hugged me and said my children were lucky to have me fighting for them, and she'd make sure they always knew they had one aunt who would tell them the truth about everything. That conversation meant more to me than she probably knew, because having someone from Ethan's family validate my choices made me feel less alone in all of this. At 8 months pregnant, I had a moment of complete panic at 3 a.m, lying awake with the baby kicking inside me and the child asleep down the hall. I suddenly worried I wouldn't be able to love 2 children equally when one was biologically mine and one wasn't, that some primal part of me would favor my biological daughter, and the child would feel it and be hurt. I cried in the bathroom so I wouldn't wake Ethan, terrified I was going to fail the child who'd already lost so much. But the moment my daughter was born and the nurses placed her on my chest, then brought the child in to meet their baby sister, I realized love doesn't divide, it multiplies. The child climbed carefully onto the hospital bed and kissed their baby sister's head. So gently, and they looked at me with this huge smile and said, "Our baby," and my heart felt full in a way I didn't think was possible after everything we'd been through. I held both my children and understood that biology had nothing to do with the fierce protective love I felt for each of them, that motherhood was built in the daily work of showing up, not in DNA, and I'd been this child's mother long before any judge made it legal. 6 months after my daughter's birth, our family found a new rhythm that was messy and imperfect, but functional in ways that mattered. The child started kindergarten and came home every day with stories and artwork, and they loved being a big sibling so much they'd rush to help with every diaper change and bottle feeding. My daughter was healthy and happy, hitting all her milestones, and watching her grow reminded me that good things could come from hard situations. Ethan and I were rebuilding our marriage one honest conversation at a time, and while some days were harder than others, we were both committed to doing the work. We had family dinners with both sets of grandparents every other week, and while some relationships remained strained and certain topics were carefully avoided, everyone showed up for the children, and that was what mattered most. My parents adored both kids equally and never made distinctions about biology. Ava and her husband were trying, bringing gifts and offering to babysit, and I let them because the children deserved grandparents, even if trust was still being rebuilt. Kylie came over twice a week to play with the kids and drink coffee with me, and those visits felt like the family connection I'd needed all along. I thought about Rachel sometimes, usually late at night when both children were asleep and the house was quiet. I felt a complicated mix of grief, anger, and gratitude that probably would never fully resolve because she'd given me the family I had now, even though the path had been so painful. Her lies had hurt everyone, but they'd also brought the child into my life, and I couldn't regret that, even when I was still mad about the deception. My children would grow up knowing their story, age-appropriate truth about Rachel and Amber, and how families could be complicated and love could survive hard things. The child already understood they had Mama Rachel who loved them and died, and me who loved them and was here, and as they got older, we'd add more details about biology and choices and how adults sometimes made mistakes trying to protect people. My daughter would grow up knowing her big sibling's story and understanding that family was built on love and commitment, not just blood. We weren't a perfect family, but we were a real one, with all the mess and complications and hard-won trust that came from choosing each other every day, and that was enough.